WFSU-FM now presents a delayed broadcast of the Economic Club of Florida luncheon meeting of July 7th, 2016. This program was recorded at the Florida State University Alumni Center in Tallahassee. Now to introduce the speaker, here's former Florida Congressman, State Insurance Commissioner, and past chair of the Economic Club of Florida, Bill Gunter.
Leonard Steinhorn was voted American University's faculty standout for the year on two separate occasions, and he was also named the honors faculty in the year 2010. He's a past president of the university's Phi Beta Kappa chapter. He also served as a political and governmental analyst for CBS News, CNN, NBC, PBS, and others. He's been published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Huffington Press. He's the author of several literary works and will be covering the Democratic and Republican national conventions for CBS in just a few weeks. So the Economic Club of Florida welcomes Professor Leonard Steinhorn to address us on the subject of Cuba on the Cusp, challenges, questions, and opportunities. Professor.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me here, and Bill, thank you for the gracious introduction, and I really appreciate the hospitality that you and Kathy have shown to me as I've come down here and have had an opportunity to see Tallahassee and learn more about your community. So I'm very grateful. Cuba. It really is quite a mystery to many of us. Okay, this is a nation that has been shrouded in sort of almost secrecy for many, many decades, ever since those days when Fidel Castro came to power and the United States essentially cut off relations. So to be able to go to Cuba on a delegation that gives you access to some of their top intellectuals and artists and thinkers and politicians and decision makers was quite a gift. But of course, going to Cuba, the first thing on everyone's mind is always, are you going to be sitting in one of those cars? Okay. So I have a few visuals for you here. That there is a 1949 Chevy taxi cab. You notice the bar in the windshield because in those years, the original windshields were not just one pane of glass. There were some of those cars sitting outside of our hotel, and there were a few others. A bunch of us had the opportunity to sit and drive in some of those cars. I was in a 1949 Chevy, which is the one on the top left, and a 1951 convertible. And when you're in those cars, you see the upholstered seats of old that they used to have on top of those nice springs, the very spacious interiors with the high ceilings that you sit in, and the cloth ceilings that they used to manufacture with the cars back then. You would see the classic dashboards, the old AM radios, the original grills, as you see up there. Some of the cars had two-tones with a vibrant paint, as you see. Some had white wall tires. It brings you back to those images that we now see in movies in Hollywood and in shows, or anyone who likes to watch old reruns of Perry Mason. And you go, wow, it's so interesting, it's so fascinating, it can't get any better than that. I think my life is complete once I've been able to drive in one of those cars. Okay? But I would say that until I began to look under what I would call the metaphorical hood of some of these cars. So let's talk about the cars themselves for a moment. The one up in the top left, I asked the driver, and it has the original engine. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, dial back to pre-1973 America, and all of our engines required lead gasoline. So what they would have to do is to put lead additives into the gasoline to make those engines work, because the lead would fill in the little holes and the pings in the engine that would be created as the car ran. So you can just imagine what it's like to sit in a car like that. I felt as if I was in some sort of virtual Flint, Michigan at that point, because the pollution was so extreme, and you can just imagine what it's doing to the society, to the countryside, because of the lead that's being left off on the side of the roads that then gets put in the ecosystem. Now, to maintain those cars, you do not see in Cuba garages. You don't see, Jiffy Lubes. You don't see any of these sort of commercial car repair places. So they have to find ways to come up with parts to be able to maintain them. There are no parts available at any stores. There is no wholesale market for anything like that. So where do they find it? Well, it's through ingenuity. It's makeshift. They will sometimes take old Soviet trucks or tractors, chop them up, and put them in pieces in the cars to be able to make them work and to function in a certain way. So besides the fact that you see these old engines that go on this old technology that have real human consequences, you also realize that in this society, to be able to maintain those cars, they have to find ways to do it that are so completely different from the way we would expect in our country. They have to be ingenious, but they have to depend on a marketplace that doesn't exist for them to be able to keep those wonderful jewels of cars that we all romanticize about before we've gotten to Cuba. And then when you're in the cars, what do you see? Well, you do see a great deal of crumbling infrastructure. And effectively, you see an economic system that in many ways is as frozen in time as all of those cars are. I like to consider these cars a symbol of Cuba today. They're steeped in a degree of romance and revolutionary legend. They're still bound in so many ways to the United States because these are all old American cars. And they're defined, and as Cuba is, it's defined in so many ways by the competing myths and images of half a century of socialism and isolation. So you get to Cuba, you see those cars, there's that wow factor, and then you look under the hood and you realize that Cuba is exactly as what Winston Churchill said about Russia in 1939, which he said, and I quote him, "A riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma." So my hope today is to maybe lift up that hood a little bit and try and provide some insights into what that enigma of Cuba is today. Now, the first thing I noticed in Cuba, being there, is what I didn't notice. There were no larger-than-life images of Fidel or Raul Castro. Which is interesting. No larger-than-life images. You do see images of Che Guevara, okay? And there is Che Guevara on the side of a hotel, lit up at night. Even though their electrical grid isn't great, you've got Che lit up at night. You'll see others from Cuban history and from their revolutionary history. You will even see a monument to the Rosenbergs, okay, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who Cuba says were basically political prisoners executed by the United States. And then there's even a park dedicated to, of all people, John Lennon. Now, a little footnote there, Cuba did not allow rock and roll music for a long, long time. It was seen as counter-revolutionary, but then they sort of began to say, that's okay, we're okay with it, and so John Lennon, to some extent, became a little bit of a cult hero. But there are no Castro images. There are no statues, no monuments, no oversized murals, and that really surprised me. And in fact, when we asked somebody there, what do you think is going to happen when Fidel Castro dies, his response was a little flip. There will be a funeral. Okay? So unlike other authoritarian regimes where it's about the leader, think of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, or even think of Russia, Vladimir Putin, think of what Venezuela was like under Hugo Chavez, there isn't that same sense of idolatry that was visible to everybody when you travel through Cuba. And whether you like Fidel Castro or not, to him, at least, Cuban socialism was not about idolatry, but about ideals and national pride. And that's very, very important to keep in mind as we go through this little journey together about what Cuba is all about. Now, yeah, the Castros have absolute power, no question about that. But the very fact that it's not about Fidel himself or Raúl himself offers insight into the notion that the Cuban Revolution was more about transforming Cuban society than about any single individual. So he may give 3-hour stem winders and like to be the center of attention, but he basically said, do not turn me into an idol that people should worship. The ideas are far more important than that. So what comes through in Cuba is not necessarily the power of Fidel or Raúl, even though they have tremendous power, but the deep sense of history they have as a country that has always, to them, been under the thumb of a foreign power. And that's very important because it predates Fidel Castro at that moment in time. And to them, in effect, their revolution was their way of saying, no más, no more, no más. This has to stop. You have to remember that Cuba was under Spanish rule for centuries. Okay? And in the 1890s, well, actually from the 1860s and 70s onwards, a number of Cubans decided to try and fight the Spanish. And that culminated in the original Cuban Revolution in the 1890s with heroes that they still celebrate and a fight against the power of Spain. And when they thought that they had been able to win independence in the 1890s, well, guess what happened? They found that it became not a nation under Spanish control, but a nation under American control. And in fact, in 1903, some of you who may know the history, Cuba, under the pressure of the United States, signed the Platt Amendment, which was the actual agreement between the U.S. and Cuba that gave the United States control of Guantanamo and allowed the United States effectively to intervene unilaterally whenever it wanted to. And here's a little footnote on Guantanamo, by the way. We actually pay a sum of about $4,000 a year to be able to use Guantanamo to Cuba, and the Cubans have never cashed that check except for once when Fidel Castro said it was a mistake. But for the Cubans, the Platt Amendment became symbolic because they lost part of their land, okay? It gave the U.S. the right to intervene anytime. And for them, they believe that U.S. economic and government interests, and to some extent, they would say even organized crime, ran the island for decades, installing at times very, very harsh dictators who answered to their United States masters and not to the people of Cuba. You have to understand that because the history is very, very alive among Cubans today. They are a people with a strong sense of this history. Whether it's fully accurate or not is irrelevant to the fact that they are steeped in this. They think about it, they know it, they talk about it, they can refer to it, and they will bring it up repeatedly when U.S. relations with Cuba are the topic. So this history is very much alive. I took the opportunity to walk through what's called the Museum of the Revolution in downtown Havana. And this is exactly the story you're told. You're told about Cuba finally freeing itself from the thumb of those other countries that wanted to control it. And you'll also hear all about the repeated American attempts, as they say, to undermine the Cuban government and bring about regime change. So this, in many ways, explains the notion that Cuban socialism, in many ways, is a proxy for a sense of self-determination, for pride, and for independence. And they see, therefore, their system as a firewall against outside influences and special interests that, to them, have done their country and their people harm. So when discussing next steps with Cuba, it's always interesting how they frame those next steps. They are under no illusions that there is going to be equality between the United States and Cuba, because they understand the great power and economic might of the United States. But they kept bringing up a phrase which is so interesting and is only understandable in the context of how they see their history, which is that we have to have a relationship built on sovereign equality. Not necessarily equality, but sovereign equality. And to them, what that means is mutual respect between two sovereign and, to them, very important, independent nations. And that's how many of them see it. Now, given that context and understanding, that has to be the baseline of how we see how the Cubans are approaching their relations with the United States. That sense of sovereign equality, defiance against their history, and a sense that they want to be able to have a say in their own future, because they felt prior to the Castro Revolution they didn't have that. Of course, they also had the Soviet Union helping them out for a long time, but they didn't like to talk about that either. But Cuba does want to engage, and that's very clear. Cuba wants to engage, and they want to begin to climb out of their near 6-decade isolation. So in the last decade, ever since Raul Castro took power, we've seen some real and tangible changes taking place. I would equate Cuban society today much more like I would talk about a rubber band. It's much more elastic than it ever has been. But like a rubber band, it will only stretch so far. So it's elastic, it's more flexible, more open, more free than it's been, but there are limits because that rubber band will only take you so far. So what do you see in some of these changes over the last 10 or so years? One of them is religion. Okay? The original Cuban Constitution named it an atheist state, and that was changed in the 1990s to a secular state. So their constitution formally changed. And in that time, from the 1990s onward, you really have seen a rise in sort of religious organizing, religious spirit, congregations growing, and it's very, very visible. The welcome given to Pope Francis was emblematic of that sort of increasing freedom that the Cubans have given to religious groups. You see, besides the Catholic Church, Protestant groups, you see Jewish groups, you see Muslim organizations and buildings, and a degree of tolerance and actual pride in the sense that society is incorporating and allowing that sense of affiliation and association in society. The one group, interestingly enough, that they are fairly intolerant of are evangelicals. I think they fear that evangelical spirit and what it could mean. And so makeshift evangelical tents and buildings are routinely torn down by the government whenever people try and get together. But religion to them, it shouldn't and doesn't cross the line into politics. It's more of a spiritual haven for people to be able to deal with the hardships of living in Cuban society and to have a form of expression that they otherwise wouldn't have. But you cross that line into anything political, then you will see the heavy hand of government come down on them. So you see more of a religious sensibility than you would have imagined in a typical socialist state. Next, you just hear far more questioning than you ever would imagine in what we would consider an authoritarian society. A lot of the academics and journalists and writers we spoke with, they were questioning the notion of a planned economy. They were talking about its shortcomings and the fact that it doesn't work very well. And they were pointing out various criticisms about how their system works, about the power of the bureaucracy, the limitations of the marketplace there. That's right out in the open. They weren't hiding that at all. There are comedians who routinely skewer those in power there. You have artists. We actually went to the home of one artist in middle of Havana. It's a beautiful old mansion that is basically where he lives, a nice kitchen. They will serve meals there. He has protégés and young artists working with him. But what was so stunning about the fact that he has this big mansion in the middle of Havana is that you look at the wall of his studio, and up on that wall are certain plates that he can show overseas and exhibit overseas and sell to people overseas, but he cannot show them in any museum in Cuba. And the reason why is that they are sort of quite, what can I say, erotic or potentially critical plates that basically show Fidel Castro sexually assaulting the nation of Cuba, and he does one a year that he continues to do, and he can sell those plates for a fair amount of money. Yet this person has a mansion in the middle of Cuba. He's free to train young artists and create protégés. He can show his art and his irreverence toward the Castros and the Cuban system overseas. He just can't do it in Havana, okay? But once again, you cannot imagine that in a really sort of strict authoritarian society that somebody who would be showing lewd images of Fidel Castro doing things to Cuba would be allowed that even freedom, if we want to use that word. And then everyday people. Look, there's no question that people worry about some of the things that they say, that they might be overheard by other people, and that might be reported, and these things do happen. Everyday people will make jokes about the system. They'll make jokes about the Castros. They'll say things that you wouldn't expect people to say in a system that we would imagine to be one driven totally by fear and anxiety and the heavy hand of government. So a typical joke you might hear from a Cuban, and some of you may have heard this already, is the joke about the Cuban and the American having a bit of a discussion and disagreement about their systems. And the American says, look, I can go outside in the Lafayette Park right outside the White House in Washington, D.C., and I can scream at the top of my lungs, down with the United States, down with the President of the United States. And the Cuban says, so what's the big deal? I can go outside our presidential palace in Havana, and I can scream at the top of my lungs, down with the United States, down with the President of the United States. So they make fun of all of this. Yes, there's a line they probably don't want to cross, because if you cross that line, there are consequences. But as I say, it's far more elastic than we might imagine it to be. And when you travel around, you don't see a big military. And in fact, I don't think Cuba has invested as much money in the military as it has in the past, in part because it realizes that if they were ever to be invaded by the United States, I mean, it would be, putting up a resistance would be no point, okay? You do not see the military in a way that you might have seen in the old East Germany, let's say, standing on street corners with big tanks and trucks, or you'll probably see in the benighted country of North Korea right now. So you don't see that. It's not as visible as one might have imagined. Here's another fascinating thing. They have access to the American media that some of us might not even have access to. Why? Well, this is sort of a funny little twist on the American embargo of Cuba. Because there's no economic relationship between the United States and Cuba, they do not have to respect any copyright laws, okay? So I was telling somebody that when I get back, I wanted to see the movie The Big Short. They said, oh, we saw it already, because it was pirated, and they were able to show it and air it and without any consequence, because there were no laws protecting them from copyright. So if you you want to cut your Netflix subscription and not pay any more in cable, go to Cuba, and you can see everything first run. It's also more fluid politically than one might imagine. There are plenty of local officials who are not Communist Party members. There are National Assembly officials who are not Communist Party members. We met with a religious leader who is very passionate about religious freedom, who serves in the National Assembly. She is not a Communist Party member. So it's not the absolute thing that you have to have. The Communist Party is not as large a factor as one might imagine, yet, let's be clear, you should have no illusions that if you want to be successful in any race of consequence, okay, it's still hard to be able to do that without an association or membership in the Communist Party. There are plenty of examples of local folks who want to run in local elections who aren't Communist Party members, whose posters will be defaced and torn down, who will be, people will put up rather insulting and demeaning comments about them throughout the community because they are not party members. So it's not as absolute as one might think, but it's still very, very influential. And then the economy, and that has been one of the bigger changes. We might call the economy going on in Cuba as reforms. Raul Castro, the socialist, does not want to admit that they're reforms, so he says they're updating the economy. But whatever you want to call it, reforms or updating, and as slow and as halting as it may be, and even with the resistance of the bureaucrats who really are the most conservative force in Cuba right now when it comes to change, they like things the old way. What's happening in Cuba right now is a recognition that things have to change. They can't go on like this. This is for a number of reasons. The average salary, monthly salary of a Cuban, believe it or not, is $20 to $24 per month. Okay? Now, some caveats on that. They have food allowances, housing assistance, their utility bills, their phone, their electricity and gas is subsidized so heavily by the government that it's only about $2 per month. Gasoline is subsidized for those with cars. Medical care is completely free. There are no property and sales taxes. But $20 to $24 doesn't get you very far, okay? It's not a society that is really producing very, very much for its people. So what are they doing to answer that? Well, one of the things they're doing is loosening restrictions on entrepreneurs. Here is an entrepreneur, a woman that we met with in that particular restaurant, who is building out her restaurant presence in Cuba, and you see a growth of these private restaurants throughout Havana. Now, I'll get into in a little bit why it's very, very difficult for them, but they are encouraged. The government supports them. The Party Congress said that there have to be more small and medium-sized businesses in Cuba. A lot of people are thinking of the Asian or the Vietnam model as a model for what Cuba could look like. But there are restrictions. And even, you see here, this is a club that deals with young people in Cuba. And this is where young people gravitate to. This is, entrepreneurs coming up with clubs and opportunities like that. So you see this very, very visibly in Havana, particularly with the restaurants. There's also an Airbnb in Cuba that is cropping up all over the country because there's a terrible hotel shortage. They don't have the capacity to bring people in. For example, during the Obama visit, they were at their limits in terms of the people they could bring in, so they were canceling all of these other tours because they just didn't have the capacity to accommodate people there. So the Cubans understand that. They understand those shortcomings, and they're increasingly allowing some of these small business people and these entrepreneurs to develop. Plus, we talk about the gig economy here in the United States, the Uber economy, the people who will take an Uber or Lyft job just to make some money. Well, you really have almost the first gig economy in Cuba, because the government has to give a wink and a nod to the fact that people have to make more money than $20 to $24 a month. So all of those people who get their cars repaired, they go to folks who have their little garages, their little off-the-grid businesses where they're able to pick up more cash and more money on these things. You have a little bit of that in agriculture as well. So even though the government doesn't necessarily approve formally some of these gig economy activities that people engage in, not so much like they approve these restaurants, they realize that they can't clamp down on that stuff, because if they do, people are going to become more and more desperate. So they give a wink and a nod to what I call their gig economy. There's also an increasing openness to foreign investment and businesses. For them, agriculture and technology are especially important. And again, I'll get to that in a few minutes as to why. They are now creating, sort of about 25 miles from Havana, a Mariel special zone. And up there you see where the building that will take in the containers, and this is some of the construction that they're doing. They are hoping that this becomes a central point port of trade for their country. It's become a point of pride as well that they're able to do this and enter into the international economy. They have some European businesses working with them and Asian businesses working with them. So this is their sense that they are opening up, they are investing in a trade economy that will bring companies from around the world. However, there's still serious government controls. Businesses that actually are signing up to work and to import there say that the only employees they can get in Cuba are those employees that have been approved by the government. Okay? So the government continues to control something where you see a contradiction between their desire to open up a marketplace and their sort of compulsive need for absolute government control. But again, it's progress, it's change, it's opening out from where they were before that. So it's clear that Cuba is making an effort. If they're not bringing their economy into the 21st century, at least they're realizing that it needs to shake up the old system of complete and absolute control to be able to make their country viable. And then they're also building on some of the successes of their system as they've had it over the last 5 or 6 decades. Like Cuba or Cuban socialism or the Castros or not, they are a country with almost universal literacy. It's a very highly educated society. Higher education is free for everyone, and everyone there can read. There is also universal health care in Cuba. They have more doctors and dentists per capita in Cuba than we have in the United States. Their infant mortality is extremely low. Their life expectancy is up to 78 years. They have a 99% immunization rate. In fact, they have trained as so many healthcare professionals that they actually use their healthcare professionals as barter or as payment for some of the goods that are entering Cuba. So rather than having hard cash and dollars, they export healthcare professionals. When Venezuela was basically providing all of the oil before Venezuela became its own basket case, providing all of the oil for Cuba for so many years, Cuba flooded Venezuela with healthcare workers. And you see healthcare workers in countries throughout the world, as these are countries that would trade energy or oil and food to Cuba in exchange for healthcare professionals. Okay? So it's quite fascinating when you realize what their healthcare system has been able to accomplish. Also, that sense of equality in Cuba. There was this very palpable sense of equality between men and women. It seems seamless and not very self-conscious. I mean, here in the United States, if a corporation has 3 women on its board of directors, it'll issue a news release and praise itself. In Cuba, it's just there. You see in every type of environment, leadership, National Assembly, businesses, entrepreneurs, what appears to be a far more seamless gender equality in a culture, something which I believe they imbibe from that ideal or principle of equality which they like to pride themselves on having, whether it's thoroughly real or not. Also, you see it to some extent with race. The National Assembly is very well represented with black Cubans. Government positions, there's a great deal of integration. Race relations seem at far more ease than they do in our country. However, they're under no illusions that they've reached the promised land, and they do believe, and they admit that they say this, they still have more work to do before claiming real equality, but it seems like they have made progress in their system. So when you put all of this together, from a human capital perspective and even a cultural perspective, Cuba is primed to engage the larger world and especially the United States. That's the glass half full. Now it's time to show the glass half empty, because it's a lot half empty. Or as Yogi Berra once said, 90% of baseball is mental, the other half is physical. Yeah, I like Yogi. Always quote him in class, yes. So before we look at all the progress and the potential, we can't overlook all of the obstacles and the damage that's taken place from years of isolation. So let's take one of their successes and unpack it for a moment. The 78-year life expectancy, okay? clearly a sign of their success in healthcare in Cuban society. But there's a big downside here, because as it becomes an aging population, people dependent on the Cuban social security system, there are not enough younger workers to support this large elder population. Okay? And that creates a problem. But why is this a problem? Well, it's interesting when you start to take this apart. A primary reason is housing. Now, if you walk through Havana, you might see this, which is sort of residential, and you don't know what's behind it, but it looks somewhat charming there. The Cubans will certainly want to show you this, which is a new housing development project, because they realize they have housing problems. But of course, this on the upper right is pretty much reserved for government workers and party people, okay? Not just sort of your rank and file. But then you walk a few blocks off the main street, and this is what you see. It's crumbling. These are housing units that really would be condemned here in the United States, but you walk by these housing units and you hear children laughing and playing and talking with their parents. There are no windows, it's crumbling concrete. You can't imagine that people are living there, yet they are. And the housing situation is so severe and so tight that what do you have? You have multiple generations living together. Okay? So you got children, parents, grandparents, maybe great-grandparents. Now, of course, those of you who might spend 25 years with in-laws, there's a high divorce rate, okay? And there's no privacy. And so there's a low birth rate, fewer kids. So you have a lot of divorces and fewer kids. And it's because of that housing situation with fewer kids coming out, because you don't have any privacy in multiple generation households. That's one of the reasons why you have fewer workers coming in the pipeline to support their social security system. So it's a sense of crisis that they have, built around the fact that they have substandard housing for so many people, generations forced to live together in small and tiny apartments in not the best of conditions, and it creates all sorts of secondary effects, such as fewer young people entering the system. And then you couple that with the exodus of people who want to leave Cuba and get out and seek a better life and come to the United States. Now, one of Cuba's biggest complaints toward us is how we encourage doctors and other skilled workers to leave Cuba. In fact, they say that we encourage doctors from some of those overseas trading, some of those other countries, to come over to the United States and come there. So Cuba says, you're helping to create a brain drain in our country, okay? And we're losing some of our most skilled workers. And for those of you who know the law, there's a law called the Cuban Adjustment Act. Basically what that is and what it boils down to is that the minute somebody from Cuba sets foot on American soil, just 1 foot on American soil, you are considered a refugee, you are given benefits, you are given housing, and you're given expedited legal status towards citizenship in the United States. You can get a green card within a very short period of time. You are considered a refugee, which is very interesting given all of the debate in our country about refugee status. Anyone from Cuba who sets foot in the United States will be considered a refugee. Now, there's a little footnote to that, which is that the minute you get your green card or your citizenship and you are a refugee from Cuba, you can fly back and forth between Cuba and the United States, okay? So here you are, a refugee, and you're routinely flying back and forth to visit with family, okay? So once again, there's a little bit of a law that we have that may encourage some of this exodus, but it's something that certainly is something that we ought to discuss when we do talk about refugees in general. So you have a diminishing youth population that's not strong enough to be able to support all of the folks who are on Social Security, and a bit of a brain drain from the types of people they might need to be able to build up their economy. So you have housing issues, you have a brain drain, and of course, the economy is a huge problem. And the thing you will hear from Cubans over and over and over again, I just moderated a panel on Capitol Hill, and there was one of the Cuban secretaries from the embassy there. Every other word was about the embargo. For them, the embargo has to end. And look, it's very clear when you look back in the memos in the early 1960s of why we created the embargo, and it was to, quote, create disenchantment and disaffection through economic dissatisfaction and hardship. The goal of the embargo was to undermine the Castro regime and create regime change. Well, the embargo is a big problem, and this is something that Cubans will talk about endlessly, and this has to be a big inflection point decision on our part in our relations with Cuba. Now, one of the reasons beyond just the lack of trade with its closest neighbor is that the embargo makes it virtually impossible for finance to take place because you can't trade in dollars. The embargo limits the ability to trade in dollars. So the Cuban banks really don't have the resources and the wherewithal to fund any businesses because they are starved of dollars. And in fact, we will enforce some of the embargo sanctions against European companies that actually trade in dollars with Cuba. Okay? So the embargo was designed to be and continues to be a chokehold. Now, there's another irony here when you look at it. Even though the embargo limits finance in Cuba and the ability for them to finance businesses, how do all these entrepreneurs get their businesses? Well, it's from the folks in Miami who are sending money to family. Okay? So we have this almost informal financing system. You can become an entrepreneur if you have family in the United States that can send you money because the Cubans allow the flow of money from the United States into Cuba to be able to fund these things. So in effect, the United States private individuals are effectively the bank to create this entrepreneurial haphazard system that you have in Cuba, even though our official policy is one that doesn't allow any form of finance. When I bought a work of art from a Cuban artist, he came to the United States with the work of art. He rolled it up, sent it to me by Federal Express, and then we communicated by email through his sister's account. I sent his sister a check, she a Miami resident, and then she was able to remit that money back to him into his account in Cuba. And that's how that works. So it's sort of a very, very curious situation where the United States is financing Cuba even though we don't allow the official finance of Cuba. Cuba also has currency problems. They have two currencies, okay? There are pesos for ordinary Cubans and convertible pesos, or what we call kooks, for imports and foreign exchange. The problem is that it's almost impossible to unify them because the Cubans realize that it could involve a devaluation of their currency, which would create more hardship. It could create inflation and destabilize certain industries. So their currency is distorted and they have a big problem. So anybody who wants to establish businesses there, even the currency create a problem. But money and finance are just the start of their economic challenges. As I mentioned before, there is no wholesale market. No wholesale market. So if you're that woman at that restaurant and you want to be able to go and buy large amounts of, let's say, tomatoes or canned goods, you have to go to a state store. And you have to hope that the state store has what you need. So what a lot of these entrepreneurs do is they rush to the state stores and pay the money at higher prices, which means because they're paying the money at higher prices and not wholesale prices, they get lower profits in what they're doing. Sometimes they can't get what they need, but if they do get what they need, they buy extra of it, and guess what happens when the ordinary citizens go to the state stores to buy the things that they need? The entrepreneurs either have them or the entrepreneurs can't get them because so many of the ordinary citizens got what they needed. Okay? So there's no wholesale market. You have to be able to create an effective wholesale market to have a good economy, and they don't have that. So those of you thinking of business in Cuba, no wholesale market, how do you do it? Good question. Next, their infrastructure. Their infrastructure really does have issues. Now, here is a typical highway in Cuba, and you see some of those wonderful cars. Here's, the revolution and, highways. So you think, for the most part, when you're on the main highways, that things are okay. But get off of some of those main highways, and this is what you begin to see. Crumbling roads, okay? Roads that are falling apart, that can't support, bridges that can't support the type of economic and activity and transportation that's required to have an effective economy. So the roads are not in good shape. Public transportation is a mess. It's crowded. So here's a typical bus in Havana, okay, a crowded bus. But it gets, that's pretty, 22nd century for Cuba right now. Here's where a lot of people might go outside of Havana, inside the back of a truck that's covered. Here's where people looking for work might go, in the back of a truck, climbing up like that, like rocks and goods. And here is, in certain rural parts of Cuba, some of the transportation that people have with a horse and a cart. So it's crowded and it's outmoded. They also have problems with their electrical grid and their water systems. And if they want to improve, what do? There are no building materials. So even if you wanted to fix some of those homes, there is such scarcity in building materials that it becomes really hard to do. If you want to rebuild some of those roads, the building materials are substandard. We hear stories about sidewalks collapsing and other things that just we don't expect to happen in a country that we are going to be doing business with. Okay? So their infrastructure is a disaster. You want to set up a factory there? How are you going to do it? Scarce building materials. How are you going to create the standards that you want to be able to have an industry in Cuba? And then, of course, in our day and age, there's the internet, which is an essential part of infrastructure in every country right now. Now, this is an educated society. You would assume that this society should be leapfrogging over some of the manufacturing parts of the economy and getting in to the knowledge and information economy. And the Cubans will show images like this. And this here is an image in Havana of a lot of mostly young people at a hotspot, an internet hotspot. And you'll see young people all over Havana. You walk through the old town and everywhere else, and wherever these young people are with their phones, you'll see it's a hotspot. The Cubans will then boast, and I've seen some of the Cuban literature from their embassy. They say there are 85 hotspots around the country, more to come. And they say 200,000 Cubans use these hotspots daily. So they're trying to say, hey, this is good. We have internet, okay? But there's a caveat here. It costs about $2 an hour for a Cuban to be able to access the internet, okay, on a hotspot, all right? And when you think about it, 200,000 daily, okay, their population is over 11 million. That's 2% of their population, less than 2% of their population having access to the internet. So imagine this room, let's say 200 people here, and only 4 of us will have access to the internet on a particular day. Okay? And as we know, the internet being central to any type of economic improvement. And if you want an internet connection at home, let's say you're a medical professional or a professor or a journalist, you need to get special government authorization. Now, so this is the human capital they have. They have all this human capital, but they are not ready for the information economy prime time if you do not have broadband and internet throughout your society and economy. Of course, why do they not want it? Well, I think the answers are obvious. The Cubans will say, well, we have bloggers, and they're critical of the government, but when you have just 2% of your population generally gaining access to it, those bloggers don't have much of an impact, okay? They really don't. Then there is another obstacle, feeding themselves. This is a very fertile country, and it should be, for the most part, self-sustaining, but Cuba imports 70 to 80% of its food. 70 to 80%. Why? Because there are strict government controls on agriculture and outmoded equipment. Here's a couple of images of what Cuban agriculture might look like. Okay? And it doesn't look like that old TV show we used to talk about, The Modern Farmer. All right? So let me get to that next slide in a minute. You have outmoded agricultural practices, which is why John Deere and Caterpillar are looking at Cuba as a place where they might be able to gain a foothold. You have scenes of tomatoes and bananas just rotting in fields because the government trucks don't arrive in time to collect the harvests. Little access to fertilizers and pesticides. So what's the end result of all of that? Well, you go into a grocery store, which I did in Havana, and you see these two scenes, okay? The one on the left, it looks like they're pretty full, but basically you have almost entire parts of shelves with just one product, set of cans, okay? So the choices you have are very, very limited. So you go down these aisles and there are a very, very limited number of products that people can buy. And then on the right, you see where they have some of their meat counters and everything. You see these long counters, maybe the size of this dais, and you'll see maybe a little bit on one corner, maybe a little bit in the middle, and a little bit at the end, and that's it, okay? So this is a country that ought to be much more self-sustaining on its agriculture, but it isn't. And therefore, the consumer, small businesses, people, farmers, they pay the price. And the final thing about this glass half empty is the bureaucracy. And it still does exist in the old command and control, status quo emphasis of society. The bureaucracy really is one of the major obstacles to change in Cuban society because they have their way of life, they have their way of doing things, and they don't want to see change. Of course, you have an encrusted political system, which is much looser than other tightly controlled systems, but people are still detained. They may not be detained for long periods of time. They may be detained only for a day, but who wants to be detained for a day and be threatened and have consequences placed on you for the exercise of free speech? So dissent is effectively stifled in its most extreme forms. Not the jokes, not the individual criticisms that people might say, but if you threaten too much, if you threaten to break that elastic rubber band, that's where you can get in trouble. And in fact, human rights really is, I would argue, the biggest wall dividing our country. And some of these conversations you have with the Cubans is quite fascinating because it gives you some insight into their thinking about human rights. And it will go back to that sense of history that I was talking about earlier. So they'll say to you, you know, you all are hypocrites, Americans. You talk about human rights in our country, but they'll look at Saudi Arabia, one of your closest allies. You know, you make a deal with Iran. Look at Pakistan. Look at some of the Gulf countries. You even allow freer travel to North Korea than you do to Cuba, okay? You're hypocrites, okay? We are far more free and have far more elasticity in our society than many of these other countries. We have equality, much more gender equality than you do in some of the countries that you are very close with, such as Saudi Arabia. You're hypocrites. You talk about human rights, but you don't practice it in some of what you do. And of course, that's a valid point. They are far more elastic and equal in Cuba than in some of these other countries. But then I said, okay, I'll grant you that America may be hypocritical here. Let's grant you that premise, okay? But it still doesn't mean that you don't have human rights issues, okay? Even if you say that we're hypocrites, you still have human rights issues. What are we going to do about them? And that's where it gets interesting and very revealing, because it does go back to that sense of history I was talking about. Because as much as the Cuban people have an affinity for American culture, they feel, and their government especially feels, existentially threatened by the United States government. And what they say is, you fund our dissidents, you fund radio to be able to cause problems in our country, Radio Marti, you have a base in Guantanamo, a military base, and you have an ongoing and official policy of regime change against our government. And you have an entire group of people in southern Florida that really would like to come to Cuba and rip our heads off, okay? And they have a lot of political power because the Cubans pay very, very close attention to our politics. And, of course, they can back this up by citing numerous American attempts over the years to undermine the Cuban government from the very day Fidel Castro took power in 1959. So from their perspective, they feel justified in protecting themselves from anything that they can label as American encroachment on their society. And then they say this, and it gets so interesting. If there were no more existential threat from the United States, we would feel far more comfortable opening up the political bandwidth in our country. That's what they say, okay? So in essence, to them, if you follow their logic, it's the United States that's at fault for their human rights issues, okay? That their restrictions on freedom and their ongoing, even if loosened restrictions on human rights, they're merely a defensive reaction against an aggressor, okay? Now, of course, that sounds to me like one big rationalization and one excuse for the Communist Party and the bureaucracy to hold on to power, but it does present us with a very, very interesting political choice. Because for years we've said that human rights must be a precondition to ending the economic embargo. But the question is whether it's worth the risk to call their bluff. That if we end the embargo, we will expect to see more human rights. So the big question for us is, do we call their bluff? So what's certain is that there are changes ahead. In 2018, Raul Castro will no longer be in power. There will be somebody new. There will no longer be a Castro in power. Travel restrictions will be looser, and there'll be more contact between our countries. In Cuba, there's a great desire to liberalize among the people, and a large majority of Americans would like to see the embargo end. But the question is how much and what type of change we will see. Because as much as Cuba is changing and trying to enter the mainstream of nations, it's still a nation and a culture that's been socialized to socialism, socialized to pride and self-determination. So yes, they want private investment, but they don't want unfettered capitalism and outsized foreign interest, because to them, the common good is far greater than individual acquisitiveness. So the question is how much the United States is willing to engage a nation that, despite our determination to rebuild it in our own image, will likely emerge with a softer form of socialism, a hybrid economy, a political expression that is still not free, but perhaps less managed, and ongoing, even if loosened, restrictions on human rights. So it's clear that the 90 miles between our two countries has gotten much shorter ever since President Obama restored relations. The question is whether it's short enough to start building a real and sustainable bridge. So those are my comments and thoughts, and I would love to hear any questions from you all. Thank you.
You've been listening to a delayed broadcast of the Economic Club of Florida luncheon meeting of July 7th, 2016. This program was recorded at the Florida State University Alumni Center in Tallahassee. Join us again next time for another Economic Club of Florida luncheon meeting on WFSU-FM.